Welcome to another episode of the Doctors and Dollars podcast, where we discuss health insights and wealth secrets. I'm your host, Nate Crannell, joined today by Dr. Ketan Kulkarni. Dr. Kulkarni is a pediatric oncologist, researcher, entrepreneur, author, and life coach residing in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. As a researcher and author, he strives to create value and develop a deep sense of common purpose while motivating others to strive to achieve their goals. He founded savvyphysician.ca in early 2021 to guide physicians to entrepreneurship, financial independence, and a work-life balance through passive income. Welcome to the show, Dr. Kulkarni. How are you?
Hi, Nate. Thank you for having me. Please call me Ketan. That's a great intro. I think you summarized it beautifully. I think the best part was describing the vision and the mission, which is so true. I think we want more and more people to join our journeys and make a bigger and positive impact on the planet. So really pleased to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I pride myself on my research before we do these things. So I
Yeah.
want to make sure I know who I'm talking to and that all the things that are important to you become important to me.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for doing that. Many times people start with asking, tell a little bit about yourself. So the way you summarized it, it really gives us a razor sharp focus.
Yeah, you bet. Well, I already know plenty about you, so I'm just going to dive in and I'm
Sure,
gonna
go
get
ahead.
deep with you today, if that's good.
Yeah, absolutely. Please.
Yeah. Well, let's start. I mean, I rattled off 5 or 6 things that you're doing professionally. You're a busy guy, but let's start with the medical side of what you do. Pediatric oncology. What attracted you to that specialty?
Yeah, pediatric hematology oncology is very fascinating field. I think, one of the things that it's a global leader in is the fact that we very early on learned that we need to collaborate and cooperate with each other. So if you look at the global pediatric oncology hematology consortium, we almost call it a consortium. There's not, thousands and thousands of people. Like when we go to, let's say, adult hematology meetings, when I'm presenting there, there's like 30,000 people, 40,000 people. That's a
Yeah.
lot of people. In contrast, the pediatric oncology global meeting has maybe 4,000 people. We know half of that crowd, and then everybody brings in a student or whatever, so you get to know those people. And remarkable progress has been achieved in improving the outcomes of childhood cancers in the last 50 years. It's been one of the most wonderful modern scientific advances. So in the early days of my residency, I was exposed to some of those projects, and I did some research work on leukemia, and that really got me fascinated. I presented that way back in the mid 2000s in Germany in the global meeting. I had a scholarship that I received to go present it, and that really changed my mind. That I said, well, I mean, this is fascinating. I attended a global leukemia symposium and meeting all the big experts. I said, this is fascinating. Never before I had attended anything like that at a cooperative, collaborative, global setting. And that it was fantastic. It was a game-changing thing. And I said, well, I certainly want to do this. So, then I trained and started it, several years ago now, and then continued my path, which still is active as a clinician, researcher, educator, and of course, there's leadership initiatives that are growing. But that core has remained a part of me, right? I mean, making a positive impact to our patients and their families, not just through direct clinical care, but through meaningful, purposeful research that can change practice. That's definitely one active part of my overall work and life, and so on and so forth. So for sure, that's a great question.
It's a well-funded specialty, right? Like pediatric cancer, I think it's something everyone can get behind. I mean, you'd have to be heartless to be like, yeah, I don't really care about kids getting cancer.
Well,
And so
I think,
it's well funded. It's well documented, I should say, as well.
yeah, I think well documented and well recognized is a better word. I think a lot of
Yeah.
people come at it as the sobbing heart angle. I think that's, of course, there's nothing worse than facing a diagnosis of cancer for anybody, particularly their children, or adolescent family members. But they really, again, it goes back to the same answer, that they really did a great job in the 60s, 70s, 80s to start working together, because we could not have achieved progress without collaborative, cooperative work. And at the same time, they did a lot of advocacy. So for example, the North American consortium is called Children's Oncology Group. The European consortium is the PSYOP group, and so on and so forth. So each group has their advocacy wings, and it's very visible. It's not like different people doing different things in without unison. They're very visible. There's one lead, so they do well to raise. It's like Ronald McDonald House in Canada. We know that's the patient support, family
Hmm.
support place. People recognize that name. It's almost like having the clear brand that, okay, this is what we're doing. It's not confusing for people, so they do okay. I mean, we do struggle with funds, and one of the biggest current challenges is access to newer medicines. Like, there's so many new medicines coming in, but even in Canada, where healthcare is sort of universally funded, we still struggle, right? There's provincial level struggles at, whether we can access a particular medicine or not, who is going to reimburse it, whether the insurance will cover it or not. So, yeah, while we're doing better than other people, I think in the changing sort of paradigm of healthcare, there's still problems to be solved. So, a point well taken.
Absolutely. So there's been a lot of, with that recognition comes a lot of research, not just with pediatric cancer, but cancer in general. What would you say, if you don't have the number off the top of your head, that's okay, but like the survival rate of a young child getting cancer today versus, let's say, 30 years ago?
Yeah, and that's a 1 hour talk, and it's one of my most fascinating talks we do. And, just
That's
like
why I brought it up.
yeah, I mean, if you just look at leukemia in the 1970s, you would have maybe 20% survival rate, right? I mean, today our leukemia survival rate is pushing 90%, long-term cures, right? I mean, that's just remarkable. And this is not with like excessive morbidity, or they're not able to function or be productive members of society. No, I mean, they're, lawyers, doctors, accountants, whatever else they want to be, in the
Mhm.
world. So they're very productive members. Now, given that there's certain high risk populations where the cure rates are still far far lower, and that's where the work is being done. So the focus of work and research in oncology now is not just to improve survival rates at any cost. It's also to do that at the cost of reducing toxicity and reducing morbidity. So it brings you into a very fascinating field. A lot of my work is involved in the latter part, right? How do we identify the predictors of toxicity? How do we prevent those? How do we provide treatments to reduce the long-term side effects? So it's very meaningful to sort of take somebody through treatment, but then nothing happened. There are no side effects. That's sounding simplistic, but even if you go through an uphill road in the beginning, and at the end you have much less morbidity than we expected, then that's fascinating,
Yeah,
because they're
fascinating.
going to become the future adults contributing to the world, right? So it goes a full circle.
Yeah, it's powerful change. What are some things that you're working on? So I know you do a lot of research. You've authored some books in that space, but what are some things that you're working on or focused on in the pediatric oncology space right now?
Yeah, so in the medical research world, our current focus, one of my focus is to work with the internationally recognized gurus, to develop some guidelines. So I work on cancer thrombosis guidelines, and some of the drug toxicity and treatment guidelines in cancer. And then some of my personal research is right now focused on what we call multiomics. So using like microbiome and genomics, and a combination of different fields such as metabolomics to identify patients or populations at high risk of toxicity, and then identify ways to prevent that. So it's very well derived from my clinical experience and the challenges we face on a day-to-day basis. So I look way beyond making a longer CV. I don't care about that. I'm caring about how do I make a purposeful and meaningful impact to our patient population, not just locally, but nationally and internationally. So that's it's very clear focus with that goal in mind of making a positive impact.
Awesome. That you made an interesting point there. Microbiome. How is someone's microbiome impacted by cancer?
Yeah, and nobody ever thought that that would be true, but in the
Right.
last 6 or 7 years, there's so much data on that our bodies, like this goes back to a little bit of philosophy, but it's worth the discussion. I mean, we never live in isolation, right? I mean, our bodies are evolving, complex being that interacts with the environment. And clearly, it was so unbelievable. Like 6 years ago, when we first published our paper on microbiome, we had categorized patients in two groups, those with infection and cancer, those without infection and cancer. And just with 10 patients in each group, the microbiome was like right and left. You could identify separately the bad actors and the not bad actors. So the body carries all these signatures that are yet to be identified. it's a fascinating world where we're just learning what that means. So yeah, I think we are just barely scratching the surface. We have a lot to learn about that. I mean, if you look at genomics, I mean, some of the national studies we run now, it's basically spit collection and you get your whole genome back. Like, who would have believed you could just spit in a tube and you've got your entire genome unpacked for very little money? Like
Yeah.
it's coming down to a few $100 and probably going to be down to nothing in the next 5 years. So
All right.
yeah, it's amazing.
Are you talking like 23andMe? You can yeah, like you said, spit into a tube and figure out all of your past history and everything like that.
And it
We
could
can
be,
use.
I mean, who knows? At least, I mean, some of the countries, like, the Nordic countries, they've done it much more smartly. They're banking everybody's samples, at birth, and then, and following those patients as they move along. We're not quite there yet, but we're getting there. We're at least doing it the other way. We are doing it in targeted populations. Like if somebody has, a major medical condition, whether it's cancer or cardiac disease or whatever, at least we are collecting their DNAs and then analyzing what their genetic risk factors look like compared to. There's so much published data. We know what the population data is. So now we are having these powerful tools to really test what those, we call them biomarkers, right? What those biomarkers are. Sometimes they are genes, sometimes they're microbiome, sometimes they are combination of signatures. So we're learning so much. It's so fascinating.
So this might be a really deep question, but is there the innovation or the technology out there right now where the Nordic countries, for example, are capturing the DNA when they're young? They can look at all of the different DNA markers that a specific kid has to say, hey, they may be predispositioned for this, and then they come in for a well checkup at age 3, and that DNA has changed to say, hey, your kid is now 3. There's a chance that they could get X, Y, or Z issue later on. Are they able to track that type of thing?
I don't think it's that close, but we are getting there. I think soon enough
Mm-hmm.
we are going to be getting there. I mean, the genes for Alzheimer's or cardiac conditions or genetically carried conditions. Certainly there is a basis, right? So in 10 years, I would totally believe that that's easily possible. That people are going to just be. But then that opens up all these insurance questions and the universal healthcare piece and what happens with
Mm-hmm.
pre-diagnosed conditions. So I think it's going to need a high level advocacy to kind of figure all that out. That because if we have identified the risk factors, then how do we deal with that problem? That's why
Yeah.
some of the smaller European countries are able to deal with it much easier because they have small populations in a very small geographic area. So they solve the problem beforehand so that we move forward. But in North America, that's not been the system, right? I mean, we're going to have to sort of borrow some ideas from them to figure out, well, how are we not going to, let's use the word discriminate against people who have an identified genetic condition, and how are we going to provide the care, like who's going to bear the cost. So it's all these complexity that gets in. And I think those are the questions for future that, as we develop the technology, how do we become smart and able to use it? It's one
Mm-hmm.
thing to have it, but then it's another thing to operationalize it.
Yeah, and I think the reason I asked that question, one, is just out of curiosity for the advancements that are out there for genome things, but also my thought goes to, okay, like the United States, where it's privatized healthcare at a cost, which is always going up. If something like that comes out, are kids then just being disqualified from care forever because they have these predisposition, DNA markers?
That's exactly the concern, right? I mean, we're going to
Mm-hmm.
need a huge system level change to sort of figure all that out, right? That's always that always comes like the way we are able to get around it is that we see patients with major medical conditions. If they already have something, it probably adds slightly less risk than the average person just walking through the door. They have no pre-diagnosed conditions. But even in that population, I think as the future unfolds, it's going to have to be figured out how they are integrated into availability of insurance and availability of care.
Yeah.
Because we know that anybody who's a survivor of a major medical diagnosis, any all takers, their healthcare needs are almost certainly always higher than the average norm of the population, including the cost of care. So I think that's, yeah, you're opening up a huge Pandora's box, right? We don't know the answers.
What does that mean for patients that are in your care then? Being in Canada, having universal health care, is there those, and this is just, I'm coming out a little bit naive, but like, is there predisposition or pre-existing conditions that come into factor of getting that universal health care, or is it, hey, you're a Canadian, you're born here, you get the care regardless of any major medical diagnosis that you've had in the past? How does that
Yeah,
work?
correct. And I think we're very fortunate in Canada, right? I mean, our population is still about 40 million, about 10% of you guys. And so far, I think we've been very fortunate that that doesn't quite play a factor in provincial healthcare. But, again, that gets into complexity of, yes, the provincial care costs are covered. But a lot of the components of healthcare still require insurance, the chronic care piece. And, so those questions are not answered properly yet. We already see that with access to, like, a friend of mine from Alberta required a very fancy medication that was $200,000 a year. So then who gets to cover the cost? And
Wow.
there was no end point to it, right? I mean, so then how does that work? Because nobody can afford that out of pocket. So then how do we supply those demands? And that's only going up. There's going to be more medical conditions and more expensive drugs that have to be funded. So I don't have any easy solutions for it, but I think the just like our other parts where we're going to go towards talking, we're going to have to start asking the questions that this is what the future is going to ask for. Like if you look at
Mhm.
adult cancers, there's so many targeted therapy molecules and so much complexity of care that's coming up. I mean, nobody can afford that. It's going to have to be provided. So you cannot have traditional models of insurance or reimbursement that are going to just, you can't say that, oh well, we spent the 300,000, now we're not going to cover you, see you later. I mean, it's just not going to happen. So there's going to need to
Yeah.
be, like, this goes into the space of working with pharma, working with the government bodies, working with the administrators and figuring it out, right? How do we provide the best care for our entire population, whatever that may be. I've heard that parts of Europe, again, they figure it out. They're working with pharma as a lump sum cost, right? I mean, okay, well, this is how much we'll pay. Then you provide whatever drug is needed to whoever needs it, right? So it requires that level of, access. It cannot be per patient or per group of population. It probably needs to be holistic. That, okay, this is the expected cost. How do we go about it?
Yeah. So in Canada, because your guys' population's smaller than ours, my thought goes to like the ratio disparity that we have. So if you think of Medicare, Medicaid in our country, you know, 20% of the users make
Yeah,
up 80% of the costs. Like the
yeah,
ones that have the severe diagnosis, they're using most of it. Because you guys have universal health care, is there that same disparity there where, for example, your friend that had someone with $200,000 a year of medicine, that's a significant cost.
yeah.
I got to imagine that it's a very small population that have that type of cost. Is there that same disparity in number of users versus the amount of cost that goes into that smaller number of users?
Yeah, I mean, the way I like, based on my epidemiological data experience, it's always like that. It's always the Pareto principle, right? I mean, there's always high users. We've been fortunate because a lot of it, especially for acute conditions, is covered by our system. But as we go forward, there's actually a lot of interest in identifying, sort of marginalized groups. For example, there's been some research done on indigenous population in Canada, and their outcomes tend to be inferior to mainstream population. So we can't say easily in one breath that access to care and outcomes are identical in all patient populations. I think there's more evidence to say they are not. So I
Mhm.
think, but the good news is that we are asking those questions, right? We're saying, okay, well, this is a problem. Like, for example, in the Northwest Territories, I've heard some, I've never sort of yet been there, but my friends who've been like, almost everybody has caries there. I say, well, why does everybody have caries? Because, a lot of the children are weaned on like juice or something like that because milk and other products are so expensive
Mhm.
that their choice is to give them something. So they end up giving them juice, which serves double purpose of quenching the thirst and, making the belly happy. So, I mean, what are you going to do if your milk is $25? You can't do that, right? I mean, so I think there's we have a very unique situation where Canada is the second largest country in the world, right? It's humongous, but then you have this small population distributed, and half of that is pretty much within 2 hours of US border or a few hours of US border. And then as you go up, there's vast expanses with very few people. So we've definitely have different geographic challenges, like compared to like Chicago or whatever, where you got 6 hospitals in 10 square kilometer area. That's just
Mhm.
not the situation, right? I mean, each province has a few tertiary care centers, and then the whole province kind of has to come centering to that place wherever it is. So this is a fascinating topic, right? This conference worthy topic, I think, and on how to sort of look at the differences.
Absolutely. It's a great segue actually into the next question I was going to ask. So, in Canada, I know that a lot of specialties are hospital based.
Yeah.
Private practice is not as common as it is in the United States. And I mean, arguably, the ratio of hospital physicians versus private practice physicians, even in the United States, is there's a big spread there,
Yeah.
even more so in Canada. So, yourself as an entrepreneur, are there frustrations there in having some of those limitations in Canada as it relates to being a attending physician who really needs to be in the hospital space because that's where your specialty lies versus going out and opening up your own private practice?
Yeah, I think again a great question. So the way to answer that is that a lot of there's a lot of private practice, but if you're a tertiary care expert, or you're let's call it, there's a better word than specialist in private care. If you're an academic physician of whatever kind, likely you're going to be in a bigger center that's going to allow you to do academic practice. So
Mm.
the kind of practice I have in the medical world is mainly academic practice. So there would be absolutely no way to do that without the resources we have here, because you need very large teams and multidisciplinary teams to actually operationalize it. So unless you really abandon that and ran like office based practice, that would be your only choice to go non-academic. So that would really not allow me to do a lot of the impactful research and all the other stuff I'm doing, because you're unlikely to be collaborating and working closely with other people and sharing the patient care. I think in terms of frustration or challenges, I would rephrase that as, I look at it from my personal angle as deliverables, right? I mean, if I'm doing my patient care, whatever time and hours that are, I focus on that when I'm doing that. And then, in my other time or whatever, time that I have, then I pick up on other things. That way, you're being honest to each of your deliverable and not mixing the two together, and so sometimes that means that, let's say, for 2 weeks you were too busy and you can't pay attention to something else, then that's the reality of it, and but then I think as an academic medical personnel practicing, you have to accept it. Your other choice, which other people do, would be that you step down a little bit and create more time for yourself. So I haven't done that yet, but in future, as I take on more advocacy and leadership roles, and more global impact roles, that may be something that I have to ask. I say, well, how do I sort of make this work? How am I being honest to providing the best care for the patients, not chewing up on that time and doing the other deliverables? So that's, I look at that as a career evolution. Most people are likely going to be more clinical heavy as they start, and as they go through their leadership ladder or whatever entrepreneurial ladder, they would kind of step down a little bit on that, not necessarily because they're bored or they don't want to do it, but then other things become more priority for their career trajectory. So like any other thing, like like private practice physicians, I also look at a lot of their practice models, and certainly they wish they could do some of the things we can do. We can go to some meetings, and we can be involved in global research. We can be involved in guidelines. They don't have that luxury. They're unlikely to be involved in high level international guideline work or anything like that. So I think it's, everything comes with pros and cons, and it's a fair bit different than how the American practice works.
Yeah, I think it all comes down to time, right? I think you
Yeah.
just made a good point of, as a clinical physician, they probably do want to spend more time in research or doing global health events like you're doing. They just don't have the time to leave their practice and their patients to do it. On the flip side, research probably gets heavy for you. I mean, it's something that you enjoy, but there's probably times where you're like, man, I'd love to take some time away from research and just kind of sit down with some patients and talk to them about different things. And there's two sides of the coin, but you've published a lot of research papers, well over 100,
Yeah, that's
which has taken up a lot of your time. Why do you feel like it's important for physicians who do conduct research to continue that and to publish their work? Is it for the benefit of all other physicians that are out there who are more clinical?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, research
Okay.
comes down to, it's also really, I look at research as a few things, So first is indirect patient care, right? I mean, if you didn't have the research, there wouldn't be the advancements that are happening. So, there wouldn't be the innovation that's happening. There wouldn't be the creative outlet that it creates. There wouldn't be the breakthroughs that are happening. So it depends on what you want. It has to align with your core values. If people are doing research just to get that promotion or something else or have a longer CV, I think in the long term that's going to just bring you frustration because it's not easy.
Hmm.
Homegrown original research is not easy. It's like building a car or whatever. You're going to have to do a lot of work outside of work hours, and it also requires high functioning teams. It needs you to collaborate with people. You have to generate funding, you have to generate ideas, you have to operationalize it. So the way it worked for me is really identifying from my clinical practice the questions that are important, and then going all the way deep. So it's like the age old dictum in medicine. It's from bedside to bedside and back to bedside, and everything in between. So,
Hmm.
uh, the clinical practice informs the questions, which then you try to strive for the answers with or without others' help, usually with others' help, and then bring those findings back to apply to your clinical practice. Uh, so I think, for me, research was a big outlet for creativity and innovation. And that's why I'm doing it. And, for the last few years, I've been really picking up projects that really make sense to me, that make sense to our practice and inform some decision instead of just okay, let's do that kind of thing. I typically like, for example, I have a number of students working with me, and for the last many years, I practically never advertise for a student to come join. Like it's they come, they find you, you kind of say, okay, I don't have the time. If you say no twice and they still stick, they're pretty serious. So then we just take them on, kind of thing. It's a process of
Yeah.
exclusion, not exclusivity, but it's more like if they're serious, then they will stick out. Rarely it happens that some student refuses, but if they refuse, then it's typically not a great fit. I just
Hmm.
explain them what the expectations look like, and I would rather, over the years I've learned that you would rather have the right fit person come in than somebody who doesn't want to do the work, because they have their own deliverables, they have their own targets. But if you're transparent and open and explain why we are doing something, I think people are a lot more motivated, right? They
Absolutely.
understand why the research is important, and I tell them that I generally don't try to take people unless they're willing to put in the work to try to get their work published, because
Hmm.
A, it's not useful for them. If they've completed the paper and published it, that actually adds to their CVs at their level, because it shows that they can take something to fruition. So, but then it also means they're going to be putting in more work than some other people who just do something and present it somewhere. So I think if that matching process is good, you end up selecting a good team members. And the other thing was very close collaborators and co-investigators. That made a big difference. If you're aligned in your mission and people are collaborating and cooperating properly, a lot of it becomes quite easy, because like for example, my computational biologist, well, I can't sit and do that, so I depend on them to process
Yeah.
all that. If I do their work, then who's going to do my work? It's a process of figuring it out. So, and
Yeah.
again, it goes down to creativity, innovation, and problem solving. So for me, that's the angle of research I go at. That it's not to just have a heavier CV that doesn't fly off with when the fan is on. That's a bad approach. And unfortunately, that is true. A lot of universities require their people to be very productive, and there's metrics and all of those things. But you will see that that often actually slows down innovation and creativity, because people are then going after metrics, right? I mean, they're like, okay, well, if I do so much collaborative research, I get all those points covered anyways, so then why bother, right? I mean, it's a good
Absolutely.
recipe for mediocrity instead of innovation. So I mean, if you look at any of the Ivy Leagues, they know this really, really well, right? I mean, that's why they have the pyramid system. You need a huge base of many different things going on so that some of those things are going to create innovation at the top. But if you have a narrow base, then, well, good luck, right? I mean, a narrow base will only have a narrow pyramid. How high can you go? So
Hmm.
somebody told me that years ago in a conference, and it really stuck. Like, if you need a big pyramid, you got to create a big base. You're not going to have a narrow, small base and go like that. It's just going to fall. So, just something to compare the two systems. I mean, only few Canadian universities have that infrastructure, like the Ivy Leagues, or maybe they don't. But that's something to learn from the U.S. system. They've done it really well, right? I mean, we cannot match the research that MIT does in engineering or computation. It's just unreal. Like they're 10 years
Absolutely.
ahead of the rest of the world.
Yeah.
But then
Well,
you have to work, you know.
you've got a pretty big base on your pyramid started, and it's generating more and more innovation, as your career progresses. But what would you say? So this is two-part question. What would you say was your favorite research project that you've been on? And the flip
Oh,
side, which research project do you think will eventually create the most human impact?
I wouldn't say there's one favorite project. I mean, I've enjoyed quite a few projects, over the years. But I've enjoyed. I'll mention some themes. So, for example, our work on cancer thrombosis has led to a lot of meaningful data points and outcomes, which we are now using and operationalizing and creating sort of next level models to identify at-risk patients and modify their treatment. So those have been very meaningful. Some of our, work on a drug called asparaginase was quite leading in the country. Like we were the first center to create, monitoring systems for the drug, and then, create a desensitization protocol for patients who underwent reactions. And that for example, is a good example. That protocol, now we published it as open access. And in the developing countries, what they would do is if you got that drug, you had an allergic reaction, they stopped, which led to poorer outcomes. And now we, and of course other people, have replicated that work too. But now they have a protocol that's freely available online. You got to just download it, and they can operationalize it and hopefully just give the medicine. And that will improve the lives of leukemia patients. So sometimes it doesn't have to be like you find the next radio waves or whatever. It can be a
Hmm.
small change that could be meaningful to all that population. So instead of avoiding that drug, now they could. So it's something like giving anti-snake venom. Like it's an allergic thing,
Hmm.
but you just have to prepare for the allergy and give it anyways, because you're not going to let the person die. So we use some of those methods of desensitization for that drug, and it really gave us great results. It doesn't work 100% of the time, but it has worked over 90% of the times. So it phenomenally. And then the alternative drug is like 4 times the cost. So not only were we able to save hundreds of thousands for us locally, it also gave us the ability to create a meaningful change, which now the globe can use, right? I mean, and at no cost. So you can have very powerful low cost innovations, homegrown as well. Some of our work on database stuff. We created some innovative databases for monitoring health, information, and that was cited across the country. And other people have been sort of following suit on it. So uh, it really depends on and then all of these questions came out of the problems we were having. We were not able to have a robust clinical system of managing data. We were not able to administer a drug, and so then we solved the problem. So I think you also have to pick good problems from your practice and then try to solve them through innovation. So that's kind of a simplistic way that I look at it.
I mean, it's true
Not
in
to
any industry, though. Any industry that has a problem, the people who make the most money or who create the biggest impact are the ones who solve the problems that people have. I mean,
yeah,
think of the
absolutely.
iPhone, for example. Think of, I mean, I'm drawing a blank now, but I mean, there's just so many different
So many
uh,
different.
innovations that have happened in the last, let's say, even 100 years, where it was just simply, this is a problem for a large population of people. We can solve that problem. We can change the world, and obviously
Yeah,
that
and
has
if
happened.
you look at, I mean, if you look at some of the work I'm doing in the authorship and coaching and sort of global work category, it's the same idea. I faced those problems. It seemed to me that physicians were not very finance savvy. They didn't quite understand finances. It seemed
Mhm.
that a lot of physicians were way out of balance. And I've talked to so many global experts. You ask them, oh, how is it going? If you're a known global expert, I expect to hear the answer, oh, it's going really well. I'm excited about that, this and that. The common answer I heard is like, oh my gosh, I can't even put up with this. I can barely wait to retire on the coast or whatever. Oh, I haven't even been to that ICU for the last year. It's been so difficult. So, oh, I don't even know I'm going to have to work till I'm 75. Like you hear all these challenges, and, I said, well, that doesn't quite make sense. I mean, these are respected global experts, but a lot of them seem to just not have it all put together. And not because they're not great, but because maybe they didn't pay attention to those issues. Or, people have big health issues or personal family relationship issues, and different things like that. So that kind of really took me, and then I saw and experienced so many people who were completely burnt out, right? So that really took me down that journey of, what do we need to do? What's wrong here? And then I went through personally, a long longitudinal leadership training, then became a coach. And then, I did so much, again, research and studying around identifying a philosophy of life that would actually work, and and gather the evidence around it. And when we did our first book, we didn't find a single resource that put it all together in a simple, evidence-based, applicable format. So we said, well, let's do it ourselves. So it took us 2 years. Yeah, it took us 2 years, and hundreds of hours of recording, and hundreds of books and summaries and references to kind of put it all together. And that then became our first book, right? I mean, I still sometimes read it and say, oh, yeah, I forgot about that. Like there's so much material in it that it's a lifetime of experience and work to apply all that information. And it was well received. And then it was funny, somebody read the first book and they said, well, this is great, but it's abstract. Can you tell me a story? That might be better. It will stick better. I said, yeah, you're just lazy, whatever. The usual reaction, right? but then the idea stuck. I said, well, the person was right. This friend is right. We need to create something that's entertaining and educational at the same way. And that's how our second book was born, right? Then it took another 2 years to do that. So, you're answering those calls and callings to create meaningful impact, right? I mean, and along the way, I've been invited to so many podcasts and so many motivational writings and articles and this and that. So it's very purposefully done so that we kind of spread that knowledge, right? I mean, a lot of knowledge is freely available. It's up to the consumer to have it and consume it. But I do see the people's standpoint, right? I mean, it comes down to definition of success, right? The society teaches us to define success in a certain way, but rarely does anybody ask, do you feel successful and do you feel satisfied, right? I mean, I found that nobody ever asked that question.
Mhm.
It's you kind of fed a cookie cutter definition of success. And then, no matter what you have, if you don't feel successful, then it doesn't matter. Like it's like, well, something is missing. And I more than the burnout, of course there's the burnout piece. We may or may not get there today, but more than the burnout, I found that a huge number of people, at least in Canada, have this thing of inner void. There's something missing. I'm not quite enjoying things. I kind of feel a little left out. Maybe I'm the odd person. There's that disparity between what they're doing, working hard day in and day out, and what their heart truly desires and wants. And there's that bridge. So part of this journey is to sort of collectively do that transformation journey from point A to point B, so that in the end we become a better healthcare provider workforce, right? I mean, we better become a better physician workforce, because who do you want? You do want an unhappy competent physician to provide care, or you want a happy competent physician providing care? Which one's better? It's anybody's
Always
guess.
happy. Always
Yeah,
happy.
right. So I mean, so if you want that, then we're going to have to do the work to ensure that the workforce actually is there. And part of your journey and work is, I think, going towards that too, that you've created some solutions for people to be able to leverage their hard-earned dollar to do more and work in their own sort of defined way. So that's where I think we're finding the common ground, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think our philosophies align in that space. You said it well. But, what you're doing in the coaching space with leadership development, entrepreneurship. You also talk about physician financial literacy, and that's something that we do. Within
Yeah,
our
it's
space at
one of the big
Grand
things.
Vision Capital is providing that financial literacy. That's I think is step one, right? If we want to talk about the pyramid analogy again, the pyramid of financial literacy for physicians, you got to create a big base. And I feel like right now a lot of physicians have a smaller base,
much smaller.
So our first thought is, create a big base of financial literacy within physicians, and then help guide them to what's going to then create more time, more ability to go out and do the hobbies and the passions that they have outside of being a physician.
Yeah, I mean, I
So
just
we're just trying
last
to free up
week.
time.
Yeah, I mean, Kevin MD just published an article that I did, and it was exactly on that. How every journey matters and how each person's individual path matters, right? Because a lot of people are pursuing side gigs. There's websites with thousands of people subscribe to show how to quit medicine. I think that's not the solution, right? I mean,
Mhm.
it's really aligning yourself and then pursuing that hobby. For a lot of people, it's not even about supplemental income. It's about the creative outlet and becoming happy and doing something that they enjoy. It could be a walk in the park. Nothing
Mhm.
wrong with that. I mean, not everybody wants to go write a book or do a podcast or start private practice. It could be simple things, or spending time with your friends and family. It could be very basic. It doesn't matter. And our second book, Soar, is precisely about that, right? I mean, sometimes you have to take the longer path, and the journey is as important as the destination. It's been kind of grilled in our heads that when you get to that X million-dollar net worth and everything is hunky dory, you're gonna have sit by the ocean sipping coffee or beer or whatever it is. But it's
Mhm.
never that simple, right? I mean, you don't know if that lucrative goal is ever going to come or it's just going to keep lurking on the horizon, and you can't sacrifice all your decades in the anticipation. And then there's the arrival fallacy that it never feels that good when you get there. So it's all
Yeah.
these psychological traps that exist, and we all fall prey to it. We're not immune to all that. But the more, like you say, the bigger collective we have that recognizes this, the better tribe we have that identifies this, that's going to lead to a culture shift where people will recognize it. And then you're right. I mean, we are also in the Canadian world trying to create meaningful solutions, right? I mean, how do we help with financial literacy? But how do we create all the guidance? But then also, how do we provide meaningful solutions to people to invest or to create wealth and to create the state of mind? So it's not enough to just create awareness. I think we also have to create the solutions. So I think that's some of the future work that's going to happen in the next upcoming years.
Do you see that happening? Obviously, that is important. Do you see that happening within Savvy Physician? Is the creating more salute, not necessarily telling them, hey, here's the mindset shift that needs to take place if you're wanting to have not only career longevity but like happiness. Not the idea of building up a big pile of money that then you spend in retirement, because if you don't have the correct solution for that pile of money, then you continue to pay a bunch of taxes.
Yeah.
If it was in a pre-tax 401k, you're gonna spend a bunch of money in taxes in retirement. Nobody wants to do that. So is the idea to not only educate them on their different options, but then also to be able to provide solutions for those.
Yeah, 100%. And it's going to be within and outside of the savvy physician idea, right? I mean, for example, one of our friends from Toronto created a physician pension plan. Some other people have done blogs. For example, I've got a student now working on a physician financial health booklet. Well, it's not limited to physicians, but we're going to focus on that first so that
Hmm.
they have actually downloadable, easy to use tools to kind of do a self test. I mean, we've learned over the years that it can be this complicated thing that takes 20 hours, right? People want it kind of quick. So some of those tools, and then it would be amazing to create some national level investing solutions. I mean, these are the vetted whatever that you can go after. They have the right purpose before people, or purpose before profit, and they're kind of sustainable and not pushing everything to the T. So so there's all this area of need is a good way to talk about it, that that we need to really work towards. And I think nobody's going to do it other than people like us who are already working towards it, right? And there's a lot more people. There's a lot of players in the Canadian space too that are really willing to go above and beyond to impact physician wellness, right? Or I just call it professional wellness. There's nothing special about physicians. It's all about professional wellness. As to if we protect and preserve our highly skilled workforce of any kind, then we're going to have it. Otherwise, you're going to just land in big trouble.
Absolutely.
It's the
So
same
on
for
on
people, right? Or whoever, lawyers,
yeah,
accountants, whatever.
absolutely. On savvyphysician.ca, you have a part talking about alternate income streams. So creating sources of income other than specifically for physicians, their primary, in your guys' world, W-2 income, right? That comes with that. We talked offline because I know that in the United States, where physicians are leaning more and more is to investing into real estate
Yeah,
as
for
an
sure.
alternate, creating passive income, taking dollars out of the stock market space, and instead of putting more into those stock market space, repositioning those and deploying those into real estate that create passive income, that create generational wealth. That's what our company helps physicians do. We talked offline. The real estate game in Canada is much different than in the United States. Things are
Yeah,
very expensive up there.
yeah.
How do you see yourself, or anybody that's in a similar space to you, helping physicians get into the real estate world? Just the barrier of entry that becomes cost. How do you guys overcome that?
Yeah, I think it's the same as research. I think you have to get started. You have to get
Good
started,
point.
get educated, and you don't have to become, the realty moguls or realty king or whatever else, the big ones. I mean, people need to understand what they need to create. They need to build strong partnerships and trustworthy relationships, and they'll get there. I think there's so many examples of people who are already there. What is needed is education and access and teamwork, and some creative financing solutions to for people to have that access, right? Easier said than done, agreed. The rules are different and complicated. Like I was saying offline before, that in any major Canadian city, there's only 10 or 12 major cities. You're never going to find a class A 5 cap property. That's impossible. Like maybe you will, maybe it exists in the unicorn world, but in the real world, I don't see it exist. Like people are going sub 4 cap. I mean, there's a huge difference, right? So which means that unless you're an institutional investor, you're never going to be able to get into that level. So I think I don't know what the solution is, but there's more and more awareness happening, and there's more and more people teaming together. I think there will be creative solutions. I know a lot of physician colleagues that are doing building, and that are doing like a little bit like mini syndications, or they're doing, group partnerships or joint ventures and stuff like that to create that. And some of them are high up there, right? I mean, there's multiple people with 8 or even 9 figure businesses, and they're doing it together or independently, or there's definitely space there. I mean, nothing wrong with good reads either, right? I mean, there's a good read that you trust. That, for example, there's a local Nova Scotian read, family grown business that has now become very big, over the years. It's not public owned, so they're not pushing every dollar. It's I know a lot of people invest into that because they give people the 5% dividend. It's almost like an annuity that, for people who are not risk takers. Okay, just make it simple, right? I mean, you put in $1 million, you're guaranteed $50,000 a year,
Hmm.
as guaranteed as possible, and then the money is floating, the money is coming back. For some people, that's peace of mind. Like, I don't have to worry about it. It's going to come no matter what happens to the stock. There's stock investing strategies. A lot of people
Yep.
in that space too, where they are really, investing in blue chip stocks or whatever, but again, that comes with the risk of liquidity. So I think it comes down to having, the money mindset and the finance blueprint figured out. That's a much bigger scope of discussion. But I think the more people that realize that there's all these different solutions there, the better it's going to get. You don't have to trust, the very expensive. For example, mutual funds are among the most expensive product in Canada and very underperforming. So it's the people are paying north of 2% MERs to get 5% returns. Like it's pretty terrible. Yeah, but it works, right? There's still, just yesterday there was a debate online, and I think 85% of the products are still mutual funds.
Hmm.
It comes down to the knowledge, right? I mean, it's like, well, and it's not hard stuff, but you have to understand that a lot of busy professionals
Doesn't make a
just
lot of
don't have the
sense. Yeah.
time or the interest or the appetite to get to learn that. They say, well, is it going to work for me? Is it making money? And most people are, risk adverse. But the question is what risk are they taking, right? I mean, what is their understanding of risk? So
Yeah.
it starts with education, and then hopefully we get to create, meaningful solutions that people can get into.
Yeah. But also the reason that that's still 85% of the opportunity out there is because of that expense ratio. Like, people aren't going to just take away mutual funds, if it's generating them money, all these companies that offer mutual funds, if it generates them more money by having a higher expense ratio, they're going to keep offering them. Like they're not going to take it away. So
I mean, it comes down to what people have to do to get away from it, right? I mean, if everybody offers it, it becomes like a systematic bias that you almost always buy
yep.
into it, right? I mean, most people don't go to the finance advisor and say, yeah, this is what I want in the portfolio. That's the rare person,
Hmm.
right? That walks in and say, yeah, this is, I want 30% blue chips. I want this. I want the alternate this thing. Oh, okay. Do it yourself. Most people want to sell the, plain vanilla mutual fund, whichever company that's there, because, most trained professionals just have no interest in all that. They say, well, what do I do? Where do I put my $2,000 a month or whatever it is? That just make me some money.
Yeah. Well, and the other problem that the financial advisors have, that it's not necessarily a lack of interest in those types of things, but it's a lack of access. Like depending on what broker they're under, they just don't have access to a lot of different solutions that are out there.
No, no,
And so they
absolutely
just
not.
offer their clients whatever they have access to.
Yeah, in my spare time, way back, I had knocked every door in the city. And it's not there's not a lot out there. It's very
Mhm.
difficult to find good advice. Everybody kind of gives you the same advice and they trash the other person's advice.
Yep.
And some of the hard questions that need to be asked, people never ask, right? I mean, or they don't know how to have the guts to ask that. Like one of the things is, well, how do you invest your money? Like most nobody goes and asks the broker, well, where's your money invested? you know
Hmm.
uh, People will be shocked by the answers. They'll be very shocked. Well, if you do your that for your money, then why not for my money?
Yeah.
So
Great
it's
thought.
different things, right?
Yeah. So on Savvy Physician, you have a couple different pieces that I think fit together: work life balance, but then those different alternate income streams. Aside from real estate that we talked about, aside from mutual funds that we talked about, what are some of the other things that you as a coach are talking to your clients, physicians or not, about how to create that work life balance, and how do you give yourself that balance by freeing up more time by creating other income sources?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to understand what success truly means to you, right? I mean,
Hmm.
the coaching world, I think, is good and bad at the same time, because there's a lot of linear coaching models that people use in terms of cookie cutter approaches, right? The first thing is is the hard thing, is to ask what that success means for that person. So we actually developed a whole exercise that gave people the success blueprint, but then realized that it's pretty hard to do. You actually have to have somebody walk through that, and that is why now we wrote Soar, that people kind of take their time to go on their own journeys. But to answer the other part of the question, I think one of the most simple things that has come across the board is, if you can convince people to just get going with some of their hobbies or something that they have left off years ago, that seems to really make a big difference, and start people ticking, right? I mean, some people want to take up drama, or do the piano or do the string instrument, start running, just a simple thing, and start talking about it, start connecting with people involved in the space. That just creates sort of a shift, in my opinion. I mean, that's a very simple tool to really ask yourself, if you had no strings attached, how would you spend your day? And then that's probably going to give you some answers. Oh, I would do a walk, I would do whatever, I would exercise, I would cook, I would find your answers. They don't have to be, it's funny, humans are funny, right? I mean, we all have the same needs, but the mix of those needs is different. Like for some people it's more money driven, for some people it's achievement driven, for some people it's emotionally driven, for some people it's compassion, helping others, whatever it is. So it's funny that we go through this complex education system but never really get to know ourselves. So
Hmm.
that's some of the key strategies I have found very useful. It's like, for example, finding my own core values. That was big. you know I wish somebody taught that to me when I was 15, because I don't think they've changed much since then. So, you only wish, right? Well, why did nobody tell me about this? Makes a lot of sense. I think if people were self-aware and knew their core values and had a good definition of success for themselves and really understood, for example, when we do the finance blueprint, well, I mean, we used to use the word 50,000, but that's a little bit harder in today's inflation. Let's say your ideal lifestyle is going to cost 100,000. Well, then that's what it's going to cost, and you got to supply it. I
Mhm.
mean, you couldn't care less about whichever billionaire making however many billions, right? I mean, why does it matter? Because if your lifestyle is $100,000 ideal lifestyle, well, that's it.
Mhm.
And if it's $500,000 lifestyle, well, then you get to supply the 500,000 as well. And so it just depends on what you want, right? And it's funny how quickly people figure out what's their bottom line, right?
Yeah.
It's only in people's head that they need a $10 million lifestyle or whatever it is. I think Tony Robbins did that way back in one of his books. He systematically breaks it down and shows that the ceiling is really not that high, right? No matter what you need to do. So it's kind of something in the head that we think you got to have whatever unlimited resources to get there. So
Yeah. Or to
if you
create happiness. I think that's where a lot of people get caught up is like, if I had $1 million a year lifestyle, I'm going to be happy. It's like, well, what all do you need? And when you truly lay it out there and say, here's all the things I need, I'm like, well, that's only $100,000 a year. That's not a
Yeah,
million.
exactly.
Yep.
And often that's the case, right? And then we also created in our first book, a simplistic sort of happiness model. And most of us believe that happiness is actually instant gratification, right? I mean, and it's not, because it's a dopaminergic curve that just goes away. And then there's the delayed gratification. But then beyond that is the true happiness, where there's really alignment of purpose and meaning. And, you're really living in accordance with your own values and creating a positive impact on the world. So that comes in. People think it gets philosophical or spiritual, but it's really not, right? It's very actionable. If you think about the best moments in your life, it's likely when you were true to yourself and did something that really made sense. Whether it made money or not is often secondary. But
Yeah.
if it was very meaningful to you, that's probably given you a lot of happiness, right?
Yeah. My only devil's advocate comment to something that you made earlier was you're talking about core values that you wish that you learned when you were 15. I would argue that, well, I mean, we've both been 15-year-old boys before. Like, you don't have a lot of experience when you're 15-year-old. And I think core values are really solidified and internally understood once you've had experience. You just don't have experience when you're 15 years old. So,
And that is so true. That is so true. I think everybody is different. And that's been at the crux of our next level of work. Because, the greatest potential for intervention is in the formative years, the adolescent, young adult years.
mhm.
But the truth of the matter is that I'm finding, just like you said, that unless people have some lived experience, work experience, and have had the struggles, a lot of, in fact, our books too, they make less sense. Unless they've had some challenges, the material doesn't make any much sense. If they say, "Oh, this is rah rah. So it's almost like the teacher, you have to be ready for the teacher to appear, kind of thing, the Chinese saying, right? But, part of it is creating those solutions. How do you then create material for the adolescent young adult population? For example, my book Soar, we wrote it in the adult, at least older teenager to adult level language. And we realized that, well, this is all very important for kids, so what do? They're not going to listen to us reading about Soar. So then I narrated the story to my daughter, and then she wrote it in her own language, and then
Mm.
naturally distilled it down to a 10-year-old. Then add plus or minus five. So then the 5 to 15-year-old, you got to give them their literature, right? I mean, something that makes sense to them. That so she morphed the tale to her liking. So then you can still give the same messages, but in their format and their taste, right? So it's the same thing, right? I mean, now, one of the big challenges some of my mentors ask me now is that, well, generate the evidence for some of these things, right? And that's how some of the next projects are happening. That we are trying to really create the evidence to create meaningful work that will affect or impact all these different age groups. You're so right, right? And then there's also the generational piece, right? That anybody who is post millennial has slightly different core values than the millennials and before. So you have to be cognizant of all those factors, I think. So that's a fascinating discussion.
Absolutely. So savvyphysician.ca is where everyone can find your what I would call your non-medical work and the impact that you're creating there. Where can people find? So you have two books, Soar, A Soul's Quest, and The Legendary Quest. Where can
Yeah.
people find those two books?
Yeah, they're both on Amazon,
Okay.
and pretty quite readily available. They are on. The second book is also on Barnes and Noble and all the major outlets. For finding me, I think I'm pretty easily accessible. I'm on LinkedIn, pretty active there, and other social platforms. So happy to reach out and connect. That's one of my favorite things to do.
Awesome. And you had mentioned that you have upcoming projects going on. So for Ketan Kulkarni and everything that you have going on, what's the next big thing in 2024?
The next big thing is, I think, going after the global impact, right? I mean, I really want to escalate, not just the impact on physicians and giving them, solutions towards finances and independence as such, but also, looking at the sustainable global goals. Like we were just talking about the climate crisis, right? I mean, really escalating the projects that have a global impact. Like we're doing a lot of humanitarian work in Asia and beyond, where we are bringing in like de-addiction and literacy and environmental awareness and all the basic stuff. That's, I see that escalating quite a bit, and then integrating with some of our work, because it all means the same thing. How can we have a purposeful and aligned life and hopefully be happy?
Awesome. Well, it has been a pleasure talking to you today. I really did enjoy it. I hope that at some point in the future, our paths cross.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Take care.